Welcome to the FacDev Lounge podcast, your faculty development podcast for Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick. In part 2 of this conversation with Dr. Shazeen Suleman, pediatrician and professor at U of T, we talk about giving POC students a voice, what white supremacy is, how can you be an ally or an accomplice, making sure we don't tokenize students, and also alcohol-related events and excluding Muslims. What can the listeners do now? Please enjoy. And so I find it fascinating to think about how we can reframe the conversation and open up that space for Black students, for Indigenous students, for other students of color, and what it means to actively do that and not tokenize, but also make sure we're doing the right thing in terms of support and stuff. And so we talked a little bit about this with Toronto about having, the most Black students enrolled in this year's class. Is that what you said, ever?
Mm-hmm.
And how did they actively do that in a way that they felt comfortable? Or not comfortable, to be fair.
I wasn't involved in the beginning parts of that process because I was a trainee myself, but I want to share a story, a conversation I had with Sir George Aline, who is the Dean of the West Indies University. I think he's now an emeritus, but at the time he was a dean. We had a conversation with him in a program I was at for public health leaders at Johns Hopkins. And I remember this so clearly because he talked about when they were setting up the university, there was a desire to find faculty that were West Indian and not build the faculty and poach faculty members who were white or non-West Indian. And someone had said, well, we just can't find any. And he said, no. If you build it, they will come. And if we make this commitment, it will happen. And sure enough, all of their faculty members are West Indian. And so sometimes I think that some of this comes back from that defensiveness, right? If we make a commitment to saying we want to make sure that Black and Indigenous students are represented in medicine, and that is our goal, then you will start to see about how can we do this. Represented is different from having one, right? Represented means, for example, I did not know this, but the Black population is the third largest minority in New Brunswick, well ahead of South Asians. And I'm sure that there are more South Asians in medical school than there are Black students in Atlantic Canada. And I think that's something telling, right? Because then that's a very concrete way of saying, well, we need to actually go out of our way now to find out what is it about our processes that are contributing to students not arriving. And again, I'm not fully involved in the Black student application process, but I can tell you that it is not about having lower standards of admission. It is the exact same standards of admission. It is the exact same MCAT cutoffs. It is the exact same GPA cutoffs. But so much of the application is not objective, right? When you look at an application and it's talking about extracurriculars, there are certain extracurriculars that are implicitly valued over others. And we've seen this even in my undergraduate program where we have essays that students have to write about and talk about like what they're going to contribute to the college. And myself and the Black students who we're supporting to make changes have said that, if someone talks about going and volunteering in insert country here, that might be seen very differently from me working my part-time job. But does that mean that I am any less valuable? And having people that understand those extracurricular differences, again, having diversity of people reviewing the files, having file reviewers that come from the same lived experience, from the same background to understand the context of that is very important. And having a community of support. And so the Black student application process separately has something called community of support, which is for Black, Filipino, Indigenous, and students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds, where they can do a free MCAT course. They can get a mentor to coach them through how do you write your application? How do you approach someone for a reference letter? It's the coaching, it's the social capital that many people have, even if they are not coming from a racialized background, even if they are coming from a middle-class background, because they're able to see other people that look like them in those spaces. If you've never met a doctor who looks like you don't even know who to ask. And so that's how they increase the number of students coming to the program. And that students also see a space for them in that program, because now there's other students who look like them, who are going to become residents who look like them, who are going to become faculty who look like them. With the caveat that we actually provide opportunities all the way through. Because I think you talked about how this has been something very difficult for academic medicine to kind of get behind compared to other forms of oppression, like poverty, like single parents. And again, look at the structures. Look at who created academic medicine. It was not created by racialized peoples. It is created as a function of the society in which we live in. And it is created as a function of, white supremacy. Not when people hear those words, they think of KKK, but that's not what I'm talking about. That's a very overt display. What white supremacy is again the structures that hold certain people in power. Look at the picture of all the premiers of Canada, right? That's a
Yes.
stunning example of what that means. It's not because individual people are believing that themselves. It's the structure in which we work in. And I think part of the reason medicine hasn't gotten behind this is because the structure of medicine and academic medicine in North America was not built in an inclusive way.
I mean, I think if the listeners want to take the next step into that, I mean, that was when I read White Fragility, and it started to frame my, scaffolding, if you will, about where I needed to move on to learn more, and which is a lot and will probably be a lifetime of learning. But that was a really nice way of really kind of contextualizing a lot of that terminology too. So it didn't become, like you said, you find white supremacy is a word that has a lot of sort of societal meaning, but has a specific meaning as well.
I wanted to add one more thought, which I think is important to understand, is I think it's important to also recognize that many of these difficulties are intersectional. And that word, I want to give credit where it is due, was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a Black feminist scholar. And this word has been around for a long time. But it came from the idea that a white woman and a Black woman have very different experiences. And a Black woman would say, you cannot separate my Blackness from my gender identity, and you cannot separate my gender identity from my Blackness. And so it's not about distilling us to a single part, right? It's about recognizing how nuanced and the combination of what we have as part of our identities. And I'm reading So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, which is, for any listeners who are interested in joining the Social Pediatrics Reading Circle, is the first book in our reading circle, as you know.
I was so hoping that you would put a plug in. I was like, we didn't talk about that before. And it would be so great to have so many people involved, because it's just, anyway, not shameless plug. We are very happy to promote it.
I'm so glad. And please do join. It's open to anybody, and we're happy to send out information about that. But she describes it so beautifully as both her owning her privilege and also her identity as a Black woman. And I think that's so important for us to remember that, like you said, Sarah, again, your hardships were real. I don't want you to feel that they are valid. And you also did not experience other hardships that some of your students and trainees may have experienced. And so it's recognizing it's not actually the sum of its parts. You can't distill it down to which is the worst. Many of these things go together, and looking at the person as a whole is so important as well, rather than just distilling it down to one part. That being said, again, I think looking at our leadership and who is coming into medical education, who's being represented in our textbooks, who are the educators versus who are the patients, is something to think about, and how we can make representation better. I know for me in my practice, many of my patients are Muslim, and it changes the dynamic when they can speak to me and know that I'm also Muslim, when we can say, alhamdulillah, or like when they tell me that the child is doing better. It creates a sense of shared understanding. And so I do think it's really important that patients also have physicians who can understand their lived experiences, and that trainees can have educators that understand their lived experiences, which means we need to have diversity, not just monopoly.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad that this is a segue into something that I really wanted to make sure that we said out loud, which is, how do you have people at the table and make sure that their voice is actually heard? So the The perfect example of that over the years has been sort of this concept of lived experience or first voice. But I find in medicine, it's like, oh, we need to have a student as part of the group, as if that meant inherently that their voice was actually heard or was even close to being as equal to the other people at the table. And that's certainly true in my community work when you want to have, people with lived experience at the table. But how do we ensure that those voices are at least on a trajectory to be becoming equal voices to, I think your example was, like if the dean is sitting at the table or the chair is sitting at the table, then the student's voice is not going to be equal. And so therefore is a sort of measure of kind of tokenism for them being at the table.
I think that's where we hear about being an ally or allyship or being an accomplice kind of factors in because, again, in the room, I may have more power as a faculty person than the student sitting beside me. And so, how can I use my power to level that playing field? How can I uplift what the student is saying so that it does gain more credibility? So, if I put my voice behind the student who says, I really think we need to have this be part of our curriculum. And I say, I completely agree. I think that's such a valuable contribution. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would like to echo that we need to put this into the curriculum, and I would like to volunteer to help make this happen. That's going to land really differently than if the student was the only person to say that. So, uplifting can be amplifying. It's not me saying, thanks for giving that suggestion, student. You know what I think? I think it would be really great if we have this in the medical curriculum through modules. So it's, not giving ownership.
Stole that idea almost and planted it with like your
right. That's
your
not
spin.
uplifting. That's not uplifting. Uplifting is saying, thank you. I'm centering on you. That was a wonderful idea. And I'm going to use my power to help do this with you. Would you like to write this together? Would you like to be the lead author on this? Would you like to take a role in doing curricular work and get credit for it? Because the other thing we have to remember is we expect a lot of free labor out of a lot of our trainees. And certainly there's something called the minority tax in academia, which is that if you are in the minority, so this could be by your gender, it could be by your race, that you are often expected to do more and shoulder more work in order to gain the same kind of power or opportunities for advancement as others. So it's important to recognize that we also not expect labor to be free, but consider that that can be compensated and valued and acknowledged in a very real way. So a student having their name be the first author on a curriculum module and then supporting them to publish it or apply for a grant with them as the first author is a really important way of doing that, or paying them to do it in a summer project so that they actually get compensated for that. These are ways in which you can actually use your power to model to other people in the room how to uplift the voice that is the most marginalized. I saw a little quote on Twitter that it looks like has been attributed to Defina Lazarus-Stewart. And diversity asks, who's in the room? Equity responds, who's trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, have everyone's ideas been heard? And justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? So when we start to frame it in these questions, we start to say we need to move diversity as a first step, who's in the room. Inclusion as a second step, have everyone's ideas been heard? But what we really need to get to is equity and justice. And when we ask those questions, we say, who can start to actually make that space more just? So one way that faculty members can do this is by really trying to center on the person who's in the room, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they're not in the majority. If you are in the majority, then get behind that person and echo their thoughts.
And you had mentioned that that was the difference, or at least offered some sort of definition and meaning around being an ally, being an accomplice, which was a new concept for me. And then we had talked previously about kind of mentorship and coaching, which I think kind of comes first in sort of those early processes, but probably ongoing. Whereas ally seems to be a term du jour that lacks the action that I know, it feels passive as well. It's like I'm standing there and I'm standing with you. But the example you gave for an accomplice, I think, was really interesting.
I'm glad you brought that up. I think you have to first know how to be an ally before you be an accomplice, because an accomplice is not about deflecting it onto yourself, right? If you have not realized how to stand beside someone and not make it about you, or not see it in a way that this is somehow benefiting you, then you jumping into the accomplice role may actually not be being an accomplice at all. So an ally is someone who's standing with you, saying, I support you, I'm here beside you. An ally in a protest setting would be someone in the protest with you. You're marching along, you've got your sign. And then say police come. An accomplice would be someone who moves to the front of the line, who says, I recognize that I have privilege. Maybe it's in this particular setting. There have been lots of examples of how white people move to the front of the line, recognizing that police are far less likely to use violence against white bodies, and staying silent, protecting those behind them to continue to carry their message. That's a very tangible and powerful example of an accomplice. In an academic setting, an accomplice might be then, as a faculty member, being the support for students, putting your name on things so that if students are trying to raise something to the dean, it's not them that are on the line for, to just get the heat. Supporting them to actually make actions a reality. If they're trying to get a club off the ground, if they're trying to get an initiative off the ground, you as a faculty member come in and support with time, even donations. Like sometimes a few $100s goes a long way to a student club. And time, I think, goes a long way to students too, being willing to sit down and offer time and really listen. And I think that leads into your question about like what can being an accomplice look like in academic medicine. I think it can look like being a sponsor. And a sponsor is someone who uses their connection and privilege to put you out for stretch opportunities, puts your name up for big opportunities, helps you get out to presentations and speaking positions rather than making it about themselves. And so traditionally, we think about really senior colleagues doing this for their junior faculty or trainees. But I actually think even as junior faculty, we can do this for our students. So there are a number of papers that I will put my student on first, even if I have done a lot of the work, because I know for them it matters so much. And this is how they can start to gain credibility and the opportunity to then get into the residency program that they want to get into. And that's a really tangible example. But another example is if a student comes to me and says, we'd really like to have a social for students of color that have a space to just decompress and rest, because rest is a form of resistance, that recognizing that so much of the world in which we live on in North America was built on black and brown bodies, that for black and brown people to actually have space to rest is a form of resistance. And so as a faculty member, you can say, I completely support that. What do you need? Do you need money? I will get you money. Do you need a space to go? I will get you a space to go. Like, are you getting any pushback from the dean? Let me see what I can do. Let me go and see
on your behalf. Yeah.
Or with you. Let me come with you.
Yeah.
Right? So often what I'll do is there's some examples more recently where I'm coming in the room and my presence alone in the room is going to shift how that interaction goes. And ahead of time, I also do coaching. We'll say, okay, let's strategize how we're going to get this to work. This is what I know about this person, and this is what I know they're really going to listen for, and this is where I think they might not listen. So how can we strategize ahead of time, and how can I coach you so I'm not just sitting beside you being like, I'm here for you, but you go do what you want. I'm actually helping you get what you want to get by providing that training that you might not have had. You might not have had the experience of going into a meeting and asking in the language that you know that they're going to get their point across. You might also say, let's come up with a plan of when you'd like me to jump in, when you'd like me to not jump in. You tell me when you'd like me to jump in. What are the things what I want to know what you're asking for, so I make sure that I'm aligned with what you want. These are examples of ways I think that faculty can be accomplices. I do think it also really feels empowering to students, as students have told me, when they put out an open letter and they see a faculty member sign it and they see your name on that open letter, and it makes them feel like, wow, you're supporting me for what I'm trying to ask for. Or that they see you sometimes at a protest, or they see you donate to GoFundMe, or they see you donate. You don't have to put it on your Instagram, but people are watching, right? People are watching. And I think a lot of students know who's someone who's a real accomplice and a real ally. They talk amongst each other. They'll tell you this person is someone safe to talk to, this person is not safe to talk to. So it's not something you might necessarily get a gold star for, or like your chief might not give you a round of applause, because it's not necessarily seen in our academic structures right now as valuable as like you writing papers or you being seen on a grand rounds presentation. But you can model that by saying, I'd really like to bring along these folks for this presentation. I'd really actually like my student to speak first. I'd really like my student to be first author. I'm not sure if that's helpful in terms of.
It brings to mind a much more simple concept that we talked about too, that I think is worth mentioning, which is the temptation to ask students just how they're doing. And I thought we should say out loud how I'm working through kind of this innate thing I have about just, like seeing students and knowing under the circumstances. And I feel like I would do this under other circumstances too, and just being like, seeing a Black student or a person of color and just being like, how's it going? Because I know that this time is weird and stuff and things. And are you being supported? But then really coming to a place where, they shouldn't be the tellers of all the things that we should be doing.
Yes, I agree. And I think it also has to come from a place of trust, right? If you don't know that student and they don't know you, and then you reach out and say, how's it going? This time is weird. It will feel tokenizing. Like they are only asking me and they've never asked me before because I'm Black or Indigenous or racialized. But if you made this part of your practice and students know you and you reach out and certainly I have reached out and said to the students that I know and have good relationships with, I want you to know that I care about you. I want you to know that I see you and I hear you, and I know that you work so hard and are so exhausted all the time. You do not need to respond to this email. If you ever want to reach out, I'm here, and I will continue to support you how I can. And that's it. Like the onus is not that I'm expecting them to tell me, no, everything is good. It's
this
not
is what you need to do, or like
right.
This is what you could do, or this is what I need to do, or whatever.
Right, because the emotional labor of asking racialized people to continually tell others what to do is exhausting.
Yeah, like this is how I can make you feel like,
right.
How can I feel more comfortable with this?
Right, and that's where I think a lot of the onus has to come onto us to say, I'm going to do the work to be more educated, and I'm going to do the subtle shifts without expecting the gold stars. Like the subtle shift in my behavior is not going to be celebrated by anybody. It's not like I'm going to get an award for suddenly asking people how to best pronounce their name, right? I'm not going to get an award for stepping up
from the students.
but that shouldn't be the motivation. And I think we might not get an award from the students because the students would be like, this is so normal. Like this should be what happens all the time. But I think expecting to be celebrated for that kind of behavior is actually something that's very like, if people are honest about it, they're looking for approval. We're looking for validation to be like, look, I'm doing the right thing. Tell me I'm doing the right thing. And I think part of doing this work has to be moving away from needing that approval that you're doing the right thing, and accepting that the right thing is the process, the messing up, the trying, and that if you only are looking for an acknowledgement that you've done the right thing, you will not be successful. Because if it was that easy that we could be like, aha, once you've done the right thing, it is solved, we would have solved this so long ago, right?
We're no longer racist.
We're no longer racist. And I, so many people with the best of intentions and the biggest hearts want to just be told what to do with a capital D so that they feel better, that they are not part of the system. And what I'm imploring gently with as much love and tenderness as I can is that that is not possible. That is not what will happen. The process is actually the outcome. The process of you reflecting and being mindful in your actions and subtly shifting how you interact. Look, if you're on a board, who's your executive, and saying, you know what, we have a problem, like I think we're not being inclusive. Let's start to look at our policies of how we get on here. Let's look at how we're reaching out to people who may not be here. And let's make explicit efforts to do that. And also make sure that when these people do come into our space, that the space is not going to drive them away. Because so much of the spaces that we operate in are still imbued with a lot of supremacist ideologies that we're not aware of. So, a very tangible example that I will use is how every meeting I go to is centered around alcohol.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you took the thought right out of my head.
Right? And I can tell you, as a Muslim person, that instant when I go to a meeting and I see that the only beverages are wine and the default is wine and everybody's talking about wine and their favorite wine and like, or choosing a bar to go to, I already feel that this is not an inclusive space for me. I am not in the majority space here. But that's an example of how we can bring folks on. And then if we go back to our default of let's go out for drinks, let's go out to a patio, let's make sure that we're getting beers for everyone. What can, that's an example of a very tiny, tangible example of how something non intentional can actually make a space very exclusive, even if you have people of different backgrounds now there at that space. And for example, what would be the difference if you made it totally non-alcoholic? Like, what would be the problem? Because like nobody has to drink alcohol, right? So, but like
its nutrient value is pretty negligible.
If you made an event completely alcohol-free, that would be considered like so strange, right? And yet, if you probe that back, they'd be like, where is that coming from? Again, it's because of who's the dominant culture here? What's the dominant ideology? If we were in a Muslim majority country, I can tell you most events don't have alcohol.
And again, that like lack of ability to be uncomfortable.
Right.
Because why do we use alcohol as part of sort of a, big societal push? It's the social anxiety, it's the like, lubrication of the conversation. It's habit. It's a lot of things that like, if we didn't have it, it wouldn't take long before people would figure out how to be okay with it. But we don't want that discomfort. So we just are like, carry on, even though it overtly continues to oppress other people in our groups.
I remember when I was in early residency and certainly before that. So I love to entertain. And we have a policy that we don't, I won't object if people around me are drinking alcohol, but we won't have alcohol in our house. And I wanted to throw a party. And I had some friends say, well, will anyone come if you're not serving alcohol? And I would have a packed apartment. Nobody minded when they got there. We had amazing food. My mom is an incredible chef. And we would have this huge spread of food and lots of like non-alcoholic drinks. And it would be packed. And maybe people left. And, even at my wedding, we had no alcohol at our wedding. And people didn't not show up to my wedding because it didn't have alcohol.
Yeah.
And certainly if someone really felt that they needed to get a glass of wine, they could have gone before the wedding, I guess. But it's an example of like something that we don't even think about as potentially othering non-dominant groups. And yet it feels uncomfortable for people to think about throwing a social without alcohol, as I've experienced, right? To say, well, do we really have to have no alcohol would be like so wild for some people to think about. And I think that that's worth like processing, like, why is that the case? And that, should the non-alcoholic drink be like set to the side? Should it more be like the alcohol set to the side and the only thing that you're showing is like the non-alcoholic beverages, or making sure you have like a wider range of non-alcoholic beverages and then you can have a few alcoholic options? There's lots of ways in which you can explore this, but I think it's like you can see how this one topic has like so much conversation. And I'm sure, Sarah, you can imagine that there would be some people who would be like completely opposed to having an alcohol-free event.
Oh, well, as being the East Coast, one of the East Coast representations on like some of our national groups that we sit on, it would be odd. But at the same time, I like to think that we're the type of people that are trying to explore that discomfort and really answer some of those questions for ourselves, which is exactly what we're trying to do with being actively anti-racist in medical education, actively anti-racist in our national organizations. And I think we've talked about a lot of really amazing, tangible things that faculty can explore and reflect on and think about and put into practice. And there's a lot of great resources that I think that we can put in the show notes that'll keep people busy for a while. And having listened to some of those podcasts and read some of those things, it doesn't end. It just,
It's a lifelong journey. It's not something that
you really begin asking more questions than you answered, but it's a process and one that is very uncomfortable, but pretty fulfilling, actually, when you just sort of think about it. And as pediatricians, I think I'm really captivated by a child's view of what's going on. And I've joked about some of the things that like my son has said, particularly about politics in the US and things of that nature. And like, it's out of the mouths of babes, right? Like, it's just from such an interesting, good place, but that you can also see some of the stuff inherently in him at 7 years old that you're like, whew, my gosh, society gets to you early. It really does. So we all have a responsibility as humans and doctors and educators to do this work, I think. I'm so thankful for your time today and your mind and your courage and your participation in this, because I think it's very meaningful. So I thank you.
Thank you for holding space for this conversation. It means more than you know.
Well, I have this subtle thought that there will be questions that come out of even this podcast and responses. So I very much hope that it means that either we get to do this again,
okay,
or that there's a way to answer some of those questions in another conversation. And I look forward to any time that we spend together, Shazeen. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, and bye to our listeners.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the FacDev Lounge podcast, our podcast for Dalhousie Medicine, New Brunswick. Look for new episodes circulated on your faculty development emails and on DMNB's Facebook and Twitter profiles. You can listen to the podcast on SoundCloud, YouTube, and of course, iTunes. Please leave comments, tell us what you think, volunteer to be a guest, or comment on any ideas for future podcasts. And of course, lastly, make sure you log your listening on your maintenance of certification, specialty, or family medicine credits. Thanks for listening.